All right, for this video, I want to talk about the child tax credit and the updates for 2023 and 2024. So there have been a couple of changes. A few things are still in the works. So we'll go over all these changes from 2022 and the pending changes that are currently in the House. And then we've also got some sample returns here. So I've got two examples. We've got the 1040 with the 8812 to actually claim the child tax credit and the ACTC. So we'll go through all of that today in this video. So let's start with the basics on the CTC and what changed from prior years. So the child tax credit for 2023, and when I say 2023, I mean the 2023 tax year, that calendar year, and that's for tax returns that are being filed now in 2024. So the amount is $2,000 per child, and that's the same as the prior period. And the qualifying children that are under the age of 17 at the end of the year. Now the age is really important because some people get trapped here. The qualifying child test for the credit is different from what it means to be a dependent, right? You can have an 18-year-old child that is a dependent on your tax return, but if they're not under 17 at the end of the year, you do not get the child tax credit for them. All right, very important to remember that. Now, the additional child tax credit, the ACTC, is the refundable portion of the credit, and the maximum for 2023 is $1,600, and that's $1,600 as of right now. That's something that's pending changes, and we'll talk about that in a bit here. Now, the maximum amount for last year was $1,500. So it is up $100 from the prior period. So what are the pending changes that have yet to be finalized? So there's a House bill just put out a couple weeks ago, HR 7024. It is the Tax Relief for American Families and Workers Act. And there are some changes in here that, if passed, could apply to this 2023 tax year. So what are those changes? The first one is an increase in the refundable portion. So the ACTC, which is currently $1,600, this could increase from $1,600 to $1,800 for the 2023 year. Now they've also got some changes in there that apply for 2024 and 2025, so there's some additional increases as well. But as far as what would apply to this year, that could change by an increase of $200. The other big change is how they calculate the maximum refundable amount. So under current law, and we'll have a closer look at this calculation when we actually look at the 8812, but under current law, the maximum refundable amount is calculated as 15% of the taxpayer's earned income over $2,500. That's the way it's calculated now. The proposed change would be to take that same 15% over $2,500, but then you would multiply it by the number of qualifying children that you have. So if you've got 2 children, it's 2x the amount, 3 children, 3x. So much greater latitude if this actually does get passed. Now, there are some other changes, again, in there that would apply to the child tax credit, but they're only going to apply for 2024 and 2025. So stuff that would be relevant next year. And some of those changes are increased to the $2,000 amount. So the $2,000 amount would go up. And you have an option to use prior year earned income in 2023 instead of your 2024 or 2025 earnings. So in other words, if your income decreases in 2024 or 5, you can look back to 2023 earned income to calculate the credit. And so that would be more beneficial to you. So the big question here is, should you be waiting to file if you're going to claim this credit because you're hoping that this bill will pass? Well, a couple of things to remember here. The PATH Act delays refunds with the ACTC anyway. So mid-Feb to late Feb is when those kind of get released. So if you're looking at your return and you see an amount on line 28 for the additional child tax credit, that means you're claiming the additional child tax credit. Your refund in whole is going to be held until mid-February at the earliest. So you're not going to get your money, and they withhold the full refund anyway. So, there's no need to rush to file right now. when the tax season immediately opens, you're better off just kind of maybe waiting another 2 weeks because, they're not going to release your money anyway. All right, so that's the first thing to think of. The other element is, and they have thought of this, right? The bill does include a Section 105 that provides that, well, if you filed the return early before this is passed, we'll go back and redetermine the amount of credit automatically and basically cut you a check. So they have thought about that. Now, anytime they claim they're going to do something automatically for you, I'm a bit skeptical, but they do have that provision in there. All right, so let's talk about some phase-outs here. The credit's available to all taxpayers that have dependents that are qualifying children. Right now, taxpayers with your adjusted gross income over certain thresholds, the credit starts to be reduced, and it's ultimately reduced to zero, right? So potentially you get nothing if your income is what they consider to be too high. And so the reduction is a $50 reduction to the credit for every $1,000 your AGI exceeds the threshold. And so the way the math would work there is if you had more than $40,000 over the threshold, you eliminate the credit altogether. All right, so let's have a look at some examples and then what are the phase-outs. So the phase-outs are relatively high, right? I mean, married filing joint taxpayers, you're going to get a full credit so long as your combined AGI is under 400K. As it starts to go over 400K, then you've got the phase-outs, and then if you hit 440,000 or more, it's completely phased out. And then the same issue for single filing taxpayers and head of household taxpayers. You get a full credit if your AGI is under 200K. If it's over, then you've got to worry about the phase-outs. Now, one thing to always remind taxpayers on the child tax credits is there's often confusion thinking that the additional child tax credit and the child tax credit are almost two completely different things, and they're really not, right? The child tax credit is $2,000 a child, right? That's it. That's the starting point. And the credit is initially non-refundable. So that means that you can use it to reduce your taxes down to zero, but if you get it down to zero, you can't get any more money back. You can't get a refund unless it meets the additional child tax credit or the ACTC standard. So the ACTC is a separate computation, but it's all part of the same child tax credit. And in these examples, hopefully that'll help kind of clarify that point. So the first example, we have John here. He's got one child, Alex, and John's wages are $85,000 a year, and he's filing his 1040 with head of household filing status, and he wants to claim that $2,000 credit. Now, based on his income, his taxes on line 18 are $7,831, so he can use that $2,000 in total to reduce his taxes down to $5,831. And in this case, there's no ACTC element, right? Because he still owes some tax. He hasn't used the credit to reduce his tax all the way to zero. Now, in the other examples, we'll see how the ACTC does kick in here. So in the first one, we're going to have John, who's got one child, again, Alex. His wages are much lower now in this example, $36,750. He's filing head of household. The total taxes based on his income are going to be $1,603. So now the $2,000 credit can reduce all of this down to zero, right? And then he's got some remaining amount that becomes the additional child tax credit, which is refundable. So if we have a look at the sample return here, so this is John's Form 1040. We can see on page 1 here, he's got his son being claimed as a dependent. He's going to claim the child tax credit, and his wages are $36,750. The total taxes he owes based on his income and after claiming that standard deduction are $1,603. So now on the 8812 is where we claim the CTC amount that's non-refundable and then the refundable portion of the ACTC. So in part 1, we've got his income up here, $36,750. He doesn't have any modifications that apply here in 2A through 2C. The total number of qualifying children under age 17 is 1. So that's a $2,000 credit per child. And then now we start to figure in the phase outs, right? So the filing status phase out based on our head of household is going to be $200,000. So line 10, it's asking us subtract line 9, the $200K, from our income on line 3, right? In this case, it's negative, so we don't report negative, we just report 0. So what we're saying here is, look, our income is below that filing threshold. So we get the full amount of the credit. We don't have to worry about any phase outs. If your income was over 200K, you'd report the difference here, multiply it by line 11, right, 5%, and that would be the reduction to the credit. So on line 12, it's asking us, is the amount on line 8 more than the amount on line 11? The answer is yes, right? $2,000 is more than 0. So we check the box for yes, subtract line 11 from line 8, and enter the result here on line 13. Now, the result here is not $2,000 because we have a credit limit that applies. So now we have to reference the credit limit worksheet to figure out how much we actually claim, and that, generally speaking, is just going to be limited to your tax liability, right? So the amount of tax liability that John has here is $1,603, right? Remember, that's page 2, line 16. The amount of tax he's got is $1,603. So the amount of child tax credit, even though we have $2,000 available, we can only claim as the credit $1,603 to reduce our tax liability down to 0. So on 1040 page 2 here, we can see line 19, child tax credit from Schedule 8812 is limited to $1,603. So it reduces our total tax to 0, right? Based on that credit, we now don't owe any taxes. But we're not done yet, right? So we had a $2,000 child tax credit. We've used $1,603. Can we use any of that excess to increase our refund check? And that's where the additional child tax credit comes into play. So if we go back to the 8812 and skip down to Part 2-A, we have the additional child tax credit computation. So the starting point here, 16A, it's asking us to subtract line 14 from line 12. So if I go back up here, line 14, 1603, subtracted from line 12 of 2000, gives us a difference of $397. So the $397 is potentially the amount of additional child tax credit that we can claim to increase our refund. Now 16B, the number of qualifying children under 17, we have 1 times $1,600. So remember, $1,600 is the limit that applies to the ACTC for 2023. This is the piece that they're trying to change with HR 7024. What they want to do is increase this for 2023 to $1,800 per child. But right now, as it stands, it's just limited to $1,600. So line 17, it's asking us to enter the smaller of 16A or 16B. Smaller is going to be the $397. Now we have the earned income cap that comes into play. So our earned income, $36,750. We reduce it by the $2,500. Remember, we talked about this on the slide. So now we're at $34,250 multiplied by 15% gives us $5,138. So now this limitation also applies to reduce any potential ACTC we have. This is also something they're trying to change, right? Remember, what they're trying to change with this computation is take this computation as it stands now, but then use the line 20 amount and multiply it by the number of qualifying children that you would have up here on 16B. So if you had multiple qualifying children, this amount would 2x or 3x, however many kids that you might have. So in our case here, the piece of the additional child tax credit is just going to be limited to the $397, right? So line 20, it's asking us if the amount on 16B is $4,800 or more. The answer is no. So we check no and then follow the instruction, right? If you're a bona fide resident of Puerto Rico, go to 21. Otherwise, skip to B and enter the smaller of line 17 or line 20 on line 27. So the smaller amount here is the $397. Enter that down here in Part 2C. So we have $397 is our additional child tax credit, which is reported on Form 1040, line 28. So we go back to our 1040, and we have line 28, the $397. So in this example, remember what we have for John here is he's getting the full benefit of the credit, right? He's got the $1,603 that's reported up there to reduce his taxes, and then he's getting the $397 refundable portion. So he's getting the $2,000. It's just being separately reported on these two line items. All right. So now let's look at a scenario where it's not so friendly, right? So in this next example, we have John has one child, Alex, who's 8 years old. John's W-2 wages are $23,000, and he's filing head of household again. Now, the total taxes John owes on line 18 of his 1040 is $221. So he's got the $2,000 credit, and he's going to use a portion of the $2,000 credit to reduce his liability down to zero. So we wipe out the full $221. But then when we calculate the refundable piece, the additional child tax credit, it's going to be limited to $1,600. So what we're going to see is that there's going to be an extra $179 that is just lost, right? We're not going to be able to claim the full $2,000. We've got $179 in kind of leakage, if you want to call it that, which is not going to be available. So if we go look at the sample for this one, we've got the 2023 1040. Again, he's claiming his son as a dependent, and so we see here his wages $23,000, and his tax liability based on his net taxable income is $221. So now let's have a look at the 8812 and see how this varies from the prior example. So we've got his income up here, $23,000, no adjustments or modifications rather. We've got one qualifying child, so a $2,000 credit. Same issue with the phase out, right? We don't have income in excess of $200K, so there's no limitation being applied there. So we've got the $2,000 full amount. It's asking us, is the amount on line 8 more than 11? Yes, so 2,000. Enter the amount from the credit limit worksheet. So we're not claiming the full 2,000. We have to look at the limit worksheet first. So we have our credit limit worksheet. So we look at the amount of tax on line 18, and that's going to be the limit for the amount of child tax credit that we can claim against our tax liability. So on page 2, the child tax credit report on line 19 from 8812 is only $221, and it reduces our tax to 0. So now that's been roughly the same process as the prior one, right? We've reduced our tax to 0, but the question is, how much of that credit can we get as refundable now? So if we go back to the 8812, have a look at Part 2A, additional child tax credit. So subtract line 14 from line 12. So we've got $221 subtracted from $2,000 gives us a difference of $1,779. So this is the amount of credit that has yet to be captured. Line 16A and B, number of qualifying children here. We have 1 times 1,600. Remember, that's the cap for the year. Could change, right? Could change to 1,800 if they get that bill passed. So we've got the $1,600 cap. We compute the same phase out, 15% of the excess over $2,500 of income. And so now the question is, how much of the additional child tax credit do we actually get to use? So line 20 here, we're not a bona fide resident of Puerto Rico, so enter the smaller of line 17 or line 20 on line 27. So the smaller of line 17 or line 20 is going to be line 17, $1,600. So even though we had $1,779 left over, we can only claim the lower amount, $1,600, because of this cap that's in place, unless it's changed to that $1,800 figure amount. So in this example for John, he's got $1,600 that he can claim as the additional child tax credit on the 8812. So when he steps back and looks at this in the totality, the amount of $2,000 credit that he actually gets for the year is limited to that. He only can claim $1,821 because of these limitations that are put in place, but may be subject to change depending on what happens in Congress. So that covers it for this tutorial. I hope that was helpful, clarifying kind of how these pieces work together. And of course, always appreciate you watching the videos, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thank you.